What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We got a short video today. I want to kind of go over shock tuning, spring selection, and all that stuff. We're trying to dial in these coilovers that we got on the FJ40. So there's a couple different ways you can do the spring selection. Basically what you want to do is figure out the corner weight of your truck. So the first way is to get scales. You can put a scale under each tire, let the truck down on it, and that'll tell you the corner weight. Another way you can do it that doesn't take any money, just takes a little bit more time, is to kind of do a couple calculations based off of the springs that you have on the coilover. So usually you'd buy your coilovers and you'd buy one spring. That way you can set all your clearances, make sure everything clears, and then you have one spring that you can calculate with. We got 16-inch coilovers on this thing, front and rear. So we know our spring is 16 inches in total length, free, with no weight on it. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna drop the weight on that one spring and then measure how much it collapses. Then we can take that number and multiply that by the spring rate, and that'll give us a really accurate number for corner weight. And then we can take that, figure out how much up travel we want, or basically how much you want the shock to compress with the new spring, and there's a little calculation you do with that to figure out your secondary spring. So what we're gonna do first, I got this front all apart right now. We'll throw the tires back on, but what you wanna do is take these secondary nuts and drop it all the way down so that there's nothing touching. You don't want the bump stop hit, and you don't want nothing touching. You want all the entire weight of the vehicle on these springs. So we're gonna drop these all the way down on all four corners, and then we'll double check the measurement on the spring. You can see it is a 16 by 25 by 250 pound. I'm hoping that's going to be fairly close. I mean, this is a heavier rig with the LS and everything in it, so we're going to try that and we'll do some calculations, see what we come up with. All right, so now you can see once we let this thing down, we should have all the weight. We shouldn't have any bump stops hidden. We should have all the weight on these springs. All right, now that we got the weight on the front and the rear springs, I went and measured the springs, and believe it or not, front and rear are right at 12 3/4. So what we're gonna do, we'll do one side at a time. So we'll start with the front. 12 3/4, what we wanna do is minus that from 16, our total length of the spring. So 16 minus 12 3/4 gives us 3 1/4 inches. So that's how much the spring compressed. Now we times that by 250 pounds for the front because we have a 250 pound spring. That gives us 812 and a half. So we know that corner is holding up 812 pounds, which that is sprung weight, not unsprung weight. Unsprung weight would be all the axles, tires, wheels, all that stuff. So unsprung weight is basically the frame, body, engine, the drivetrain, but the axles and everything is obviously not weighed with that. So 812 for the front, and then for the rear is a 200 pound spring. So we'll take 3.25, 3 1/4 times 200, that gives us 650. So now that we got our corner weights, you kind of got to know what you want for a ride height. So what I'm gonna do, you basically need to know how much shock shaft is collapsed into the shock at ride height. So we got 16 inches of travel. Say we want 6 inches of shock shaft showing. That would mean we have 10 inches of shock shaft into the shaft. That's how much the shock sagged down. So we take that 10 inches and we would divide that by our corner weights, and that would give us a inch pound number, and then there's a spring chart that you can go off to find your spring rate. So I'm gonna do a little messing around and figure out kind of what I want for ride height. I kind of had in mind what I wanted, but it's been so long I kind of forgot. So I'm gonna mess with these shocks a little bit, get this thing sitting how I want it, and then we'll measure how much shock is exposed. We'll take that and minus that out of 16 inches because we have 16-inch shocks, and that'll give us our number that we need for our calculation. All right, I think I got the look I want. That is 5 inches of shock shaft showing front and rear. Now, this thing is a little bit trickier to set up because the rear fenders are cut up a little bit, but the fronts I raised quite a bit. So when the truck is sitting level, it just looks off because the front fender is so much higher. So I feel like we need to have a little bit of rake kind of pointed the front just a little bit lower than the back. I think I like that look. Now we can adjust this a little bit with preload, but you want to be pretty close. So we got this figured out. We got 5 inches showing, like I said. So we have 11 inches basically collapsed into the shock. So what we want to do is take our corner weight and then divide that by 11 inches. Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of weight. So the front we were at 812. I'm just going to estimate because we don't have a winch in, we don't have seats on the interior, we only have a couple of gallons of fuel, and there's no driver. So I'm going to just add 500 pounds for a driver, for a full tank of fuel, for our seats and brackets and center console and winch. I think 500 pounds is somewhere in the ballpark. So I'm going to take the 500 divided by 4 just to make it easy because, you know, you got the winch on the front driver's seat is right in the middle, and then the rear seat's in the back. So I feel like it's going to be pretty equally distributed. So we're going to take 812, we're going to add 125 to it. So that gives us 940. So we're going to take 940, divide that by 11 inches of collapse of shock, and we're going to get 85. So here's our numbers. Front 85 and rear 775 divided by 11 is 70. We're going to go to this spring stacker chart. This is from Wide Open Design. Huge thanks to you guys for figuring all this out for me. Front is a 250 pound. So we're going to come over till we see our 85. So 250, there's 83 right there. We're going to go up. That looks like we need a 125 pound spring for the top spring on the front, and the rear is a 200 pounds. So we'll go over till we see a 70 or something close. Looks like 67. We either got 67 or 77. 67 is closer. We can always add a touch more preload if we want it a little bit higher, but that's a 100 pound spring. So we need a 125 pound and 100 pound. So I'm gonna go order up those springs. Like I said, 125 for the front, 100 for the rear. That should get us really close. Now we can add or take away we can adjust our preload a little bit. Obviously, you don't want to compensate too much. If you have way too light of a spring, just cranking down the preload, that's going to screw everything up. So we don't want to do that. We want to get close on spring rate, and then we can fine tune with preload. Now, as far as the dual rate nuts go, what those do is basically bottoming resistance. Just think of it as bottoming resistance to where the heavier spring will take over and the front spring will stop working 100%. So basically, you have that slider. When you have your nuts up, your both springs are working and you're getting the dual rates, which is way softer. And that's if you're bottoming out a lot, you can drop those dual rate nuts down. Once that spring secondary slider hits those nuts, it totally takes out the front spring. It does no more work, and it 100% relies on the bottom spring, which is way heavier, which will help with bottoming out because it's going to be way stiffer at the bottom. So there's no magic number for that. It's 100% preference. It's 100% your own setup on your truck, but that's kind of how those dual rate adjuster nuts work. But either way, we're going to go through all that later. Let's go order up some springs. Once we get them, we'll throw them on and we'll see how close we were. we got the springs on, looking good. Last thing we got to do before we throw these back on is we got to charge them with nitrogen. These things come completely empty. So what we're going to do, we got a nitrogen bottle here. Basically what we're going to do with this one, it's just got a regular air chuck on it. Those are just a regular Schrader valve. So regular air chuck on the hose. Open it up and you'll see these gauges. If I can do this, there we go. So that's on there. And then we'll adjust this till we get to 200 PSI. That's what Radflow recommends for charging these things up, 200 PSI. We just want to get this thing up to 200 right there. And then, like I said, just grab the cap off of those and hit that thing until it doesn't take any more pressure. And then we're just going to call it good with that. All right guys, got all the springs on, got the shocks charged, we got everything mounted up. We are looking good. Now, with this thing sitting on the lift at full droop, you want the axles all the way down. Now is when we set our preload on the spring. So you can see the springs are pretty loose right now. You can see the rattling around. What we basically want to do is turn this top nut down until there's just a little bit of preload. You just want to get rid of that loose spring. And then once we get this thing completely together, we can adjust the height a little bit. They say if you're within 1 inch, that's acceptable. If you're like 3 inches out, say if you want to raise the truck 3 inches with a preload, that just kind of screws with the spring rate. So you really should just buy a heavier spring. And then another thing is obviously side to side, none of these trucks are ever even. So you can use that preload to kind of even out, make sure everything's level. So that's the game plan. We're gonna get the preload, just a little bit of preload on these springs, and then we'll set this thing down on the wheels and tires. Make sure our height, if all of our calculations were correct, we should be pretty close to what we decided we wanted for our height. And then once we get our ride height set, that's when we go through and we adjust those secondary nuts. So I'll show you that once we get this thing down on the ground. So you can see we're getting close right there. That's where we want it. The springs are, obviously you're gonna hear the slider hitting the shock body, but the springs are tight. They're not just floppy loose. So we wanna start with that. That's just a starting point. We'll start with that. We'll get this thing on the ground and see where our ride height is. Well, look at that, guys. We are very, very close. We got 5 inches exposed in the front, 6 inches exposed in the rear right now. I think I might just even it out. I think I'm gonna drop the rear a ½ inch and maybe raise the front a half, just to kind of even it out. The front is kind of diving down a little bit. All right, that's about our final ride height. Now, I am expecting these springs to settle a little bit. So Once they break in, it may drop down a little bit, which I wouldn't complain with. That's why I kind of added just a touch more preload than I thought was necessary. Now that we got that set up, we can set up these secondary nuts in here. You can see right there. So there's no magic number on where you want those nuts. 100% dependent on your own vehicle. What they say to do is just start off with like 3 inches from, you're sitting at ride height right now. Have about 3 inches of gap between the top of the slider, which the slider is the plastic piece in between the two springs. From the top of that slider to the bottom of your first nut, have about 2 to 3, maybe even 4 inches depending on your travel. So I'm gonna start with about 3 inches, and then once we're up and running, once we're driving, hitting the trails, we'll just have to kind of feel and adjust as necessary. You know, if you're bottoming out a lot, then you're gonna wanna drop that nut down so that you stiffen up that suspension sooner in the cycle. It'll help out with bottoming out. So that's kind of the game plan. We're gonna start with 3 inches, and then we're gonna go through and adjust our bump stops as well. All right, we got that all set up. You can see from the top of that slider right there, we got about, I went actually 2.5 inches. I'm gonna shorten it up just a little bit. We're gonna try that. So now I want to set up the bump stop height. You can see the front there and then the rear. They're the same threaded bump stop. So we got a ton of adjustment there. So how we want to adjust the bump stops is find our part that contacts first, whether it be coilover, whether it be tire defender. On the rear specifically, the coilover collapses first, and then obviously when you flex, this tire will raise higher up and we'll hit the fender there. So we got 6 inches of shock shaft showing. That obviously takes 6 inches to collapse, so we're going to take 3 inches out of that because that bump stop has 3 inches of travel. So we'll take 3 inches out, so that leaves us with 3 inches. That means we need to have a gap from the bump stop to that pad of 3 inches. On the front, little different story. The track bar will hit the diff cover here, right up here. That'll be the first point of contact. So I'm going to measure that out, get our general measurement there, and then we'll take that and we'll adjust the front bump stop for that one. Well, that about sums up the suspension on the 40. Now, like I said, once we get this thing done, running, driving out on the trails, there may be some fine tuning adjustments with that dual rate adjustment nut, or those second nuts that we adjusted, as well as pressures in the bump stops. Now, it's kind of a balance between the dual rate adjusters and the bump stop pressure. What you kind of want to do is set it up to where the dual rate adjuster, it hits and it slows down that compression enough to where when you hit your bump stops, it's not a super harsh just jolt when you just smack your bump stops. So it's kind of a little bit of fine tuning with the balance between those. But either way, that's about a wrap for this one. Springs are on, everything's on. This thing's sitting how I want it. It's looking good. I'm excited. We got a few more things to check off the list on this thing before we kind of bring it out and have a little fun with it. Well, anyways, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this one. Why don't you go smash that thumbs up button, comment, subscribe. We'll catch you in the next one.